You seem to me to be not as alarmed by Trump as I am. How would you characterize your level of concern about his presidency?
5 days a week, I wake up and I say, this is within the range of normal American politics. He's a populist. We've seen populism before, and the Constitution was set up for the eventuality of a demagogue in the White House, and it's working. He's constrained, so chill. And 2 days a week, I wake up and I think, I wonder if it felt like this in the final years of the Roman Republic. And I think that's about the proportion. I think a historian needs to be very skeptical about some of the claims that have been made by, I won't name names, by those who warn that we're descending rapidly towards tyranny by analogy with the Weimar Republic. I mean, that just strikes me as a terribly inappropriate analogy. And I'm impatient with the talk of tyranny, and I will name names. I disagree with my dear friend Andrew Sullivan about this, and I disagree with my friend Tim Snyder about this. I don't think we're descending into tyranny. And I think if one simply locates the Trump presidency in the context of American history, leave aside the Weimar Republic, there are numerous precedents for what we're seeing. And the most likely outcome at this point is not the collapse of the Republic, it's the impeachment of the president after the Democrats win back the House in November. That's pretty much the base case at this point.
Right.
However, I think it would be excessively sanguine to say that that's the outcome with 95% probability. After all, didn't we learn in 2016 not to have too high confidence in our political predictions? I write a weekly column. That's a good discipline. You're forced constantly to assess your expectations, make sure that you're updating your views. And my column has blown hot and cold for the last 2 years, between dismissing Trump as a hopeless candidate to recognizing that he might very well win. And I veer around as I write at the moment, between thinking that dreadful mistakes are being made and then reflecting that, for example, if one just compares outcomes, comparing year one of Clinton with year one of Trump, and leaving aside the personalities, they're not so very different. It's a difficult line to tread for the obvious reason that in this polarized public sphere that now exists, the man who goes down the middle is in the crossfire. It's very much easier. It would be easier for me to have gone full never Trump, as some of my friends have done. But my sense is that that's not the correct posture for a critical thinker. The critical thinker has to say, what is this like historically? And it is not like the collapse of the Weimar Republic. It is much more like the populist wave of the late 19th century, which was a backlash against globalization and produced Trump-like figures, even if not a Trump presidency. And I think if one takes that approach and tries one's best to be dispassionate, one arrives in this almost uninhabited center ground. It's a lonely place, I have to say. It's not much fun because you're kind of hated by both sides. If you go on MSNBC, you're accused of being a Trump apologist. And if you go on Fox, you're far too critical of the president. Drives me crazy. But this is precisely the pathology that the Square and the Tower is about, that we have created this extraordinarily polarized public sphere in which to take some balanced middle position is almost by definition to be dismissed by everybody as a trimmer.
Right. You function largely, if not mostly, in conservative circles, I would imagine. I mean, you have an appointment at Hoover, and I'm just imagining what your network looks like. I imagine you have everyone is well represented, but you're certainly no stranger to conservatives. What do you make of the fact that concern about Russia's influence in our election is so politicized? And how is it that conservatives, perhaps conservatives generically, but certainly the Republican Party, have become enamored of Russia and Putin when they were the party that a few short years ago had congratulated itself for winning the Cold War and ending an evil empire. What's your perception of Trump's entanglement with Russia and where the Russia investigation is likely to go? But then how do you make sense of the fact that Republicans seem to think this is a species of fake news?
Well, let me preface this by saying a word about my own network, which is, I hope, a relatively diversified one. If you are a Harvard professor for 12 years, believe me, you get to know a lot of liberals and indeed progressives. And I think if one were to graph my social network, one would be struck by its bipartisan quality, because I've never believed that friendship should be based on political affiliation, and indeed a friendship circle that is politically homogenous really is a problem.
Yeah.
So I guess part of what has made me able to tread this middle ground has been the fact that I talk to people who hate Trump and I talk to people who love Trump, and I even meet occasionally people who feel like me, ambivalent. On the Russian question, I wrote about that during the election. I actually said in one column that it was the principal reason that I couldn't, if I were a citizen, vote for him, because the evidence was too clear, even in October 2016, that something funny was up when Trump's speeches started to include fake news that had originated with the Sputnik website. You didn't need a PhD in Kremlinology to realize there was mischief afoot. How far the mischief went remains to be revealed, and that is Robert Mueller's hard task. I don't know. I do think that there was an attempt by the Russians to penetrate the Trump campaign, just as they hacked the Democratic Party's email servers. I think there were some people in the Trump campaign who were certainly open to that penetration. If it's going to be shown that collusion occurred, I think the bar will be quite high, but we'll see. The key point you raise is, why are Republicans not more worried about this? I think one has to not acknowledge that some were. John McCain, after all, was quick to identify that there was something fishy, and indeed was one of those who brought Christopher Steele's notorious dossier to the attention of the US authorities. So it wasn't all Republicans, but we're in, as Andrew Sullivan has written, a tribal political time, and insofar as Russia looks to the Democrats like Trump's Watergate, the Republicans have to play House of Cards defense against that, no matter what they may inwardly suspect or fear. I don't think that's particularly new. The Republicans weren't exactly in a hurry for Nixon to fall, and only abandoned him when there was simply no way of refuting the evidence of obstruction of justice. I think it will be very similar this time around, in that the big issue will be obstruction, and the Republican Party will stick with Trump until there is no way of being able to do that. If his approval rating stays in the 38 to 40% range, then they're not going to desert. They deserted Nixon when Nixon was in free fall. So let me make clear, this is not new territory for American politics. What should strike us is its familiarity. And it wasn't just Nixon. With Reagan, it was Iran-Contra. With Clinton, we all know what the impeachment was about. This is how American politics is played. It's a contact sport. I think if you ask me to guess what the outcome will be, it will be closer to Iran-Contra than to Watergate. because I don't think Mueller will be able compellingly to show collusion and obstruction. He will be able to show all kinds of funny business, money laundering, and who knows what else between Trump administration personnel and the Russians. I don't think the public will regard that as sufficient grounds for terminating the presidency early. It might even backfire on the Democrats if they pursue impeachment on that basis. But that's my guess. We really don't know. The evidence isn't all out. But it's a familiar narrative. And that's, I think, important to bear in mind when one reads that we've entered some new and terminal state for the Republic.
I guess the one thing that strikes me as unfamiliar is that here you have not just ordinary corruption or accusations thereof, you have the hostile influence of an outside foreign power, which is the very power that this one party has made so much hay about opposing. If I could think of an analogy for the Democrats, it would almost be like if their candidate showed some sign of, past affinity and collusion with the Ku Klux Klan or something, and Democrats who have made much about their commitment to social justice and their non-racism, they then pretended not to care, and the Klan's not so bad, and positions you can't imagine anyone staking out. I mean, Putin is, prior to Trump, every Republican's worst nightmare as an ally, and yet now Putin is fairly popular among Republicans.
I don't think I would put it quite as starkly as that, Sam, because I think we're not dealing here with the Soviet Union. We're dealing here with a Russia that has at least a kind of patina of democracy and market capitalism, not to mention nationalism as opposed to socialism as its core ideology. And both Republicans and Democrats tried over the years to find a modus vivendi with Putin. I think the reality is that Putin has wrong-footed us repeatedly because he is a tactically very gifted leader, even if he has a weak hand. So I'm not that surprised. The number of Republicans who have been consistently anti-Putin is a small one. Apart from John McCain, Lindsey Graham is one of the few who have consistently criticized Putin. In truth, Democrats and Republicans aside have struggled to know what to make of him, and at times have suggested we can find some modus vivendi with his regime. So I don't think it's quite as stark as you suggest. I think what's novel is not that the Russians tried to hack the election. This was routine in the Cold War, and both sides did this in multiple different places. What was novel was that the Russians figured out how to hack the electronic platforms where politics increasingly is played out. And this was creative. It was only 8 years ago, I think, that Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen were telling us that the internet was basically the friend of democracy and the foe of dictatorship, and that seemed to be true in the so-called Arab Spring. But some dictators got the message and figured out how they were able to use the internet. And when you think about all the things that the Russians did, it's hard not to be impressed at their ingenuity, not only succeeding in getting access to crucial email servers on the Democratic side, but also, and this was really where they were brilliant, creating an army of bots to produce fake content on Twitter, and then using Facebook not just to advertise and to get adverts seen by as many Americans as voted in the election, but this is the pièce de résistance. They use Facebook to organize events in the United States, summoning up pro-Trump and anti-Trump or pro-Muslim and anti-Muslim crowds. That really was a remarkable triumph of the dark arts of modern intelligence operations. So we are, in that sense, we're in new territory. in every other respect, we've been here before, and I show in the Square and the Tower that the Russians have a long history of trying to hack networks. They brilliantly hacked the British establishment when they managed to recruit the Cambridge spies. But the technological side of this is new, and I don't think we've fully grasped its significance. One final point, Sam. I think it's important to recognize that although the Russians did a lot with Facebook and Twitter, I don't think that was decisive in the outcome of the election, because their share of total content on these platforms was actually pretty small. So much content is produced on these platforms by ordinary Americans. Billions of posts, 10 billion posts on election-related themes in the year up to the election, that those Russian ads were really a drop in the ocean. So they did a good deal of mischief, but I don't think they were the decisive variable. And part of the problem with the Mueller inquiry is that I think it's tending to exaggerate in our minds just how important the Russian role was. I suspect that if the Russians had stayed home and done nothing, that Trump would still have won by a comparably narrow margin, because what was being done on Facebook and Twitter by Americans was far more important than what was being done by Russians.
Yeah, although as you point out, I think it was only, 39,000 votes that had to be different to swing this?
We don't have such sophisticated historical models that we can rerun the past in a kind of series of Monte Carlo simulations, changing each variable. So I can't give absolute precision to the counterfactual, but I feel more confident in saying no Facebook, no Trump, than I would in saying no Russian meddling, no Trump.
You wouldn't say that of the DNC email hack? I mean, if Hillary hadn't had to deal with that and Comey hadn't had the brilliant idea of revisiting it 10 days before the election, I think in terms of what happened to her poll numbers when Comey came out again, I think it's, at least Nate Silver has come out and said that certainly swung the election. Yeah,
we can argue about this for the rest of the podcast, given that it was so close. It's one of these overdetermined events.
Yeah.
You could, of course, make the same argument about a whole range of things, including Hillary Clinton's failure to go to the 3 swing states that she should have been campaigning in.
Yeah.
I think this is where history runs out of precision. We can't definitively say how the past would have turned out. We can only speculate. But I think it's a more compelling counterfactual to say if the election had been run without the network platforms with old style technology, then she would have won handily.
Yeah.
Whether Comey's one decision, whether the hacking of the email servers would have been were they as important as you're implying? It's much harder to say in a close election. Remember, and this is a key point that people forget, she was a terrible candidate. There was a ton of material that you could have thrown out on social media about why Hillary Clinton shouldn't be president without any help from the Russians and Julian Assange. There was plenty of non-fake content helpful to a Facebook campaign designed to discourage people from voting for her. And that, I think, is often forgotten in some of these counterfactuals, where I'm afraid people tend to simply change one variable that suits their predilections and assume that everything else stays the same,
right?
Which, of course, is how things work.
Yeah, well, I fully agree that the result was overdetermined, and I think you could point to at least 3, but probably 30 things that had anyone been different, the result would have been different.
I agree. I think if there had been no, let me give you another example. If there had been no ISIS terrorist attacks in the 18 months on the United States territory in the run up to the election, I think Trump would have had much greater trouble. That was a huge issue for him. Didn't get much traction amongst the coastal elites, but it was a huge issue amongst middle American voters. And so, there are any number of variables in this model that you can tweak to get a different result. That's in the nature of close results.
Yeah. In the immediate aftermath of Orlando, I remember on my blog, I wrote a section of a speech that I thought Hillary could have given that would have inoculated her against the disastrous difference between her and Trump's messaging on that point. I mean, she was, in the aftermath of that, all she did was admonish people not to be racist and talk about gun control. It was just catastrophic.
And Trump, that August, gave a speech on Islamic extremism, a substantial part of which one had to agree with. And he was the only candidate, including all the other Republican candidates, who was willing to to talk in those terms. I think if one's talking about 2016, one shouldn't just talk about the Russian intervention. One should also talk about the Islamist intervention, because those terrorist attacks, San Bernardino and then Orlando, had a massive effect on voter sentiment. When Trump came out with strong language, it polled as strongly as anything else he said in the election. So this is why it is a story of networks, but we tend to underestimate the importance of the Islamist network. And as I try and show in The Square and the Tower, one of the peculiarities of our time is that although the network revolution hasn't radically altered Christianity, it has had a big influence on the development of Islam. And the Sunni extremists have understood, as well as anybody in the world, how to use these tools to advance their ideology. And that's another thing that doesn't show much sign of stopping. The numbers of attacks, their global dispersion, the ability of Islamic State to continue to convey its message even when it loses the territorial battle in Syria and Iraq. These things seem to me as important historically, as consequential historically, as any of the other things we've talked about so far.
Yeah, actually, I want to touch that topic, however briefly, because it's a topic of our mutual concern. But before we do, you've used this word several times, which seems to be uniquely significant in your line of work, this concept of the counterfactual, what might have happened had things been different. How do you think about counterfactuals as a historian? It strikes me as a strange thing to have to keep doing, but basically any value judgment we make about any outcome, implicit in it is a sense that things would have been better or worse had something else happened. Every moment where I feel committed to castigating Trump and anyone who has supported him for the state we're in, implicit in that is some assumption that things would have been better had Clinton been elected. But the truth is, I spend almost no time trying to picture what life would be like under a Clinton presidency. It's a default assumption working on the hard drive that I almost never revisit. How do you think about counterfactuals?
Well, first, you should revisit it. And I think for the reason that you gave, that any statement of a causal nature, let's say, implies a counterfactual. And if you're going to do that, you better make it explicit. It's a lot more intellectually honest. I think quite a bit about what a Clinton presidency would look like. It was the high probability scenario that didn't materialize. One thing that one would want to ask about that scenario is how would the defeated Trump voters have responded? Because the idea that they would simply have shrugged their shoulders and said, oh, well, better luck next time, strikes me as implausible in the pretty toxic atmosphere of November 2016. One way of thinking about the Trump victory was as catharsis for the most disgruntled people in the United States. Had they not had that catharsis, one has to ask what the consequences would have been. But
that's too interesting to let go by. So please roll that forward to the prospect of impeachment.
Well, the reason I use the term catharsis is that I do think that there was something extremely ugly brewing in Middle America, and Trump's victory was cathartic for those people who were most aggrieved. Had he lost, there would certainly have been the claim that the election had been rigged. There would have been an absolute avalanche of fake news about that. And I think there would have been certainly demonstrations rather different in character from, say, the Women's March, which was the big anti-Trump manifestation of the immediate post-election period. There would also have been in Washington a completely different sequence of events in which the familiar cast of characters from Clinton world reappeared in positions of power, confirming the hypothesis that the Manhattan Martha's Vineyard elite were in charge. And this, I think, would have fueled a pretty ugly backlash. I think the other thing in this counterfactual scenario to remember is that let's assume the Republicans would still have held the House and the Senate, assuming we're just giving the presidency to Clinton, there would have been instant gridlock. And the question, I think, which is harder to answer, is what the Republicans would have done if they'd found that their base was perhaps literally up in arms. So I think it's important not to imagine that all would have been well in the best of all possible worlds if she had won. I think we would have been in a pretty ugly place anyway. The reason that I think in this way is partly to challenge your listeners to play out this scenario as a thought experiment. I published a book 20 years ago now called Virtual History, a collection of essays by myself and others, trying to make the case that one should be explicit about one's counterfactuals. If one believes, as I did and do still, that Britain made a mistake in intervening in the First World War in 1914, one has to show what the consequences would have been had Britain stayed out. That the war would have been shorter, the Germans would have won, but their goals were limited, that there wouldn't have been a Russian revolution under those conditions, and so on. I have fought a 20-year battle against historians who think that this is somehow methodologically wrong. And the problem is they don't really understand the philosophy of history. They don't even understand the basic logic of arguments about causation, which anybody trained as a lawyer understands. One can't really make statements in a court of law about causation without submitting those statements to the but-for test. Mm-hmm. I have no doubt that I shall remain in a minority in believing that counterfactuals should be explicit, but I think I'm right. Sometimes being right condemns you to being in a minority.
That's the T-shirt we should have printed.
Well, it's certainly been my experience. I mean, a good example of this is the argument about the British Empire, which I've wasted too many years of my life on. Anybody who wants to argue that the British Empire was an unmitigatedly bad thing has to show that, for example, India's economic development would have been faster, outcomes would have been more benign under, say, Mughal rule or the rule of any of the Indian princes that would have remained in power. I've based all of my work on a deal with the reader that if I'm making an argument of a causal nature, I'll make the counterfactual explicit. I know I can't conclusively show you what the world would have been like under these altered states. That's beyond the powers of history as a discipline. History is an imaginative discipline. Hugh Trevor Roper made this point many years ago, and before him, R.G. Collingwood, one of the great Oxford philosophers of history. As we engage in history, we are essentially conducting thought experiments. But those experiments ought not to be circumscribed by silly rules like we should only write about what actually happened and present our readers with the facts. I mean, if one does that, one's incapable of making any causal statement, and one simply writes a chronicle.
But to connect what you just said to the prospect of impeachment, first I should point out is that what you said about the counterfactual and the possibility of civil unrest in the aftermath of a Clinton victory, that once again puts the onus on the Trump supporter, if not Trump himself, who we could well imagine would have been instigating all that, and essentially was preparing the ground for that in his campaign, the way he was talking about the election being stolen before he won it. But do you have the same concern about what might happen if the Mueller investigation runs its course to a point where that would satisfy every Democrat?
Historians should also like paradox as well as irony and counterfactuals. I think the paradox is that it's ultimately going to be better for liberals that Trump got his chance to be president than if he had not got that chance. Because we see on a daily basis that the man of the people is an oligarch and the beneficiaries of the policies are not the forgotten people of middle America. Liberalism is doing brilliantly well out of Trump. Liberal newspapers have seen their circulation surge. The Democratic Party is awash in cash, if only it had a few better candidates. If you run the experiment of Trump not winning and Clinton owning the government, the conspiracy theory would be unassailable. And Steve Bannon would be a far more formidable figure outside denouncing the conspiracy than he was when he was inside as chief strategist and proved unable, in fact, to rise to the challenges of government. So my paradoxical view is that liberalism will ultimately be the beneficiary of the Trump presidency and conservatism will be the casualty. The question of impeachment, I think, should be seen in that light. By the time we get there, if we get there, let's assume the Democrats win back the House. It's not certain. I think it's 50-50 at this point. Let's, for the sake of the experiment, assume that they win and then impeach him. We know from the experience of Clinton and also the Iran-Contra scandal that it can backfire on Congress if it goes down that road. It doesn't necessarily guarantee the collapse of a presidency. Clinton became more popular even as he was being impeached. Congress is not a popular institution. It has the lowest approval ratings of any major American institution. And I think if they go down the impeachment road with a weak case, i.e. it's money laundering, it's previous business dealings with the Russians, or even with there was collusion, but actually it was Jared, the president wasn't involved, then I think that Trump's base will rally to him and it will not prematurely end the presidency. It might even make re-election a more likely outcome. So the Democrats have to handle with care if they do find themselves in this position. I don't think impeachment would be a wise proceeding unless Mueller really has compelling evidence of collusion and obstruction of justice.
But do you worry that the situation is politically is as combustible as it was at the time of the election and that the response...
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is, because that's the point about catharsis, that the people who
discharge the energy.
Yeah, and now they have to live with the reality of the Trump presidency.
Right.
And rationalize as best they can the beneficiaries of the tax cut being corporations and the very rich, and rationalize as best they can the fact that he just offered an amnesty for illegal immigrants to try to get whatever wall he can get built. I mean, in the end, the compromises that populists make in power are their undoing. One argument I've kept making, and I'll make it again for your podcast, Sam, is that this isn't fascism, it's populism. It's a massive category error to compare Trump to Mussolini, much less Hitler. He is a populist in the late 19th century vein, and the populists of that period didn't last long for the very simple reason that when you try and do the things you said you'd do, whether it's to raise tariffs on imports or to restrict immigration, it doesn't actually work. It doesn't deliver benefits to your core supporters. And they pretty quickly spot that. So that's the way I think about this. Having been put to the test by being elected and becoming president, Trump is almost bound to disappoint his supporters over the 4-year time frame. And if he doesn't, if the economy miraculously keeps going all the way to 2020, if wages rise in real terms in ways that they didn't during the Obama years, then he'll be entitled to re-election because he'll have delivered something to the kind of people who didn't get much out of the previous 8 years. One can't rule that scenario out. And when I ask myself, is this a 2-year presidency, a 4-year presidency, or an 8-year presidency? Well, probably I incline to the 4-year view, but I wouldn't give very low odds to re-election. Presidents tend to get re-elected, even ones as mercurial as Trump.
Okay, well, like with many things Trump, he has absorbed more energy than he deserves. But I found that very interesting, especially the counterfactual discussion.